G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and thank you so much for coming to Economics Academy. We joked 2 weeks ago that it was our penultimate episode. This is the ultimate episode, so welcome along. We're so glad that you could join us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. Canberra is Ngunnawal country. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend a warm welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. As mentioned, this is our final episode, the ultimate episode of Economics Academy Semester 1. We really appreciate that you've all joined us. We've had more than 6,000 people register, which is a pretty great turnout for economics, in my opinion. And we're so pleased that you've joined us all along the way. Just a reminder that all the content will be up and available on our website. That's nb.tai.org.au/economics_academy_1. We'll send an email out with the recording of this webinar, as well as you should already have received one with this week's tutorial. But before we get into today's webinar, just a few tips to help make sure this all runs smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of Richard and Matt. You can upvote questions from other people and make comments as well. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out. We don't have to do it very often, but we will if we have to. If you find the chat distracting, just click on the chat button. It'll come up as a separate pop-up window and you should be able to minimize it and keep it out of the way. And finally, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it'll be posted on the homepage after this webinar today. Our two instructors, as usual, are Richard Denniss, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, and Matt Grudnoff, Senior Economist at the Institute. And today we're going to be talking about when markets fail, and picking up a theme that we kind of touched on 2 weeks ago in our penultimate episode, why billionaires are a sign of market failure. So, oh, my cat's just attacking my foot under the table here. Just to recap, Matt, I'll come to you first. Remind us what a perfect competition is and when markets work perfectly. What does that look like before we go into when markets fail?
Yeah, so markets work really, really well under perfect competition, and there's a number of assumptions that we went through last week on what constitutes perfect competition, and that is there has to be lots of buyers and sellers, a huge number of buyers and sellers, so lots of competition. There has to be no barriers to entry. So there's nothing that would stop another firm from entering the market, for example, and setting up in the market. And this helps because if firms can enter the market, then if firms in the market are making big profits, then new firms can enter the market, add competition and undercut them and lower the price. There has to be perfect information in the market. So that is all the consumers and all the producers know exactly all the prices that are available. They know the quality of the products immediately, and they can compare the products really well in order to get the best deal for them. And finally, that there are no externalities. Now, externalities are basically things that impact people who aren't involved in the transaction. So the most common are like negative externalities, like pollution, so greenhouse gas emissions. If you're producing electricity from coal, your decision to buy electricity from coal is going to impact future generations and other people who aren't consuming electricity from coal through climate change, is an example of an externality. So when those conditions are set, we have what's called perfect competition. There never is perfect competition. Some markets are more perfectly competitive than others, but we don't have any. And they're the conditions for when markets work really, really well.
And so if any of those conditions aren't met, the market's not working as well as it could.
That's right. So that's when we have market failure. And the market might be failing just a little bit, or it might be failing quite a lot. So you might have a situation where, we have lots of cafes. It's not quite perfectly competitive, but it's pretty perfectly competitive all the way through to, you know, you might have a monopoly on the distribution of electricity. In that particular case, there's only one firm and it's failing pretty much all of the assumptions of perfect competition, and it requires a lot of intervention in the market from the government.
All right. So, Richard, moving to when markets don't work well and when these conditions are failing, what does market failure actually look like?
Well, yeah, good question. The fact that a market fails according to the sort of perfect competition model doesn't mean there's a crisis, and it doesn't mean governments need to intervene. What market failure tells us is that we might have a problem. And then we have to decide for ourselves as individuals or on our collective behalf as a government, is it a problem big enough to worry about? And is it a problem where the solution is kind of, where the solution is better than the problem? So the existence of market failure can occur, for example, when, you know, Matt said you need perfect information. Everyone has to know everything that's going on within a market. Well, that's clearly not true. You know, if I go out for dinner in a new city, I'm walking down the street, I see there's a bunch of restaurants around, I see there's menus in the window, I can vaguely figure out what they serve and how much it will cost, but the only way to figure out if the food is tasty is to sit down and eat it. So we don't have perfect information there, but not many people kind of panic about that and think, oh, we must force all restaurants to offer free tastings of all their meals.
That could be good, though.
Well, it'd be quite good. But what we've all done intuitively is think, look, the stakes are low. If the meal's bad, you won't go back. So if people serve really crap food, they'll probably go broke in the long run. So we kind of tolerate lots of market failure all the time. But if I'm pouring pollution into a river and destroying the downstream fishing industry and the downstream tourism industry, we probably want to intervene. If there's 20 people supplying food in a city, that's probably not perfectly competitive. But if there's only two, we probably worry about what we call a duopoly a lot more. We think the odds of those two people getting together and colluding and ripping off consumers is a lot higher. So kind of market failures everywhere. That's not proof of a problem, but it's proof that we need to be on guard when someone says, don't worry, market forces will fix it. Market forces won't fix every problem, and they won't do a great job of fixing a lot of problems. You know, it's boring, but it's so much about judgment. And we've tried to turn everything into the science of economics, but when we're talking about coming up with regulatory or other interventions to fix market failure, it's really a judgment call.
I want to pick up the idea of public goods, which you mentioned in the tutorial, and I guess it also lends itself to externalities of market failure. But we've got a pretty big water market in the Murray-Darling Basin that doesn't seem to be going well. But water's obviously, you know, a pretty amazing resource that we all need to consume for the public good. Am I thinking about public goods in the right way there? Or am I heading down the wrong direction, Matt?
Yeah, not quite. Not quite. So a public good, so again, economists like to take plain English words, attach economic meaning to them, and then pump them back out into the community where we can then tell you you're wrong. You know, so Eb, you're wrong. You've used the word public and good, but not in the way we reckon you should. So a public good is a special kind of good that markets will always do a terrible job of supplying. So, you know, we've talked about cafes, we've talked about electricity. Some goods the market will do a terrible job of providing. And there's two criteria that economists think about for a public good. One is the product has to be non-excludable. That is, you can't actually really stop someone using it. So if I make air fresh in Canberra, it's very hard for me to make it unfresh for you, right? So if I make tasty food, I can exclude you from my restaurant. I can say, well, it's $20 to taste the food. Whereas if I make air fresh and clean everywhere, it's very hard for me to make it polluted for you. The same is true for safety. If I kind of employ a police force to sort of make a city safe, it's very hard to knock on an individual's door and say, you have to pay for safety. because what if they don't? The city's still safe. So when we can't exclude people from a good, and the other assumption of a public good is it's non-rival, and that is that if I eat an apple, that apple can't be eaten by you. But if I watch a show on Netflix, it doesn't reduce the amount of show that you can watch. So when we have these weird products, we call them public goods.
So another example might be investigative journalism.
Absolutely.
Four Corners. So me watching Four Corners doesn't mean that you can't watch it or enjoy it. And what was the other one? Non-rivalrous and non-excludable.
Yeah, so we can exclude you. We can put it on pay TV, for example, or we can put it in a newspaper, which you have to pay to get it. But it's certainly non-rival, and kind of from an economic point of view, if something's non-rival, this is really important. It's not scarce. There's no reason to ration something that's not scarce, right? There's no economic reason to say you can't have some if there's heaps of it. So again,
things like education, our health system, are those the types of, what are some other examples of public goods, just to give people an idea of what we're talking about?
So education's an interesting one. We can keep you out of school, easy, no problem at all. Try getting into a private school. They keep you out all the time. But once we've educated you, we can't stop everyone benefiting from the education we gave you. Other people's ability to read the newspaper improves my democracy. Other people's ability to read a warning sign makes my driving down the road safer. So vaccination, we can exclude people from getting vaccinated. That's easy. But we can't exclude people from the benefits of lots of other people getting vaccinated. So when we have goods with these weird kind of qualities, it makes a lot more sense for the government to directly provide them.
Okay, Matt, next up I want to follow up with you. I think we've talked a little bit about monopolies and oligopolies in the market. Can you give us a couple of examples of what those might look like? I guess I'm thinking of kind of Coles, Woolies. But what's a natural monopoly, and how is that different to those other things that we've already kind of talked about previously?
Yeah, so probably people know what a monopoly is. It's when just one firm sets up in a market and sells. And obviously an oligopoly is when only a few firms and they have lots of market power and they can sort of manipulate the price to increase their profit. So a natural monopoly is this weird state where it's actually, so firstly, let me take a step back. Monopolies are usually inefficient. They're very inefficient because they've got no competition. They're able to jack up their price, reduce their quality. You still have to buy the good from them. So they don't have to work very hard for their customers and they can charge a high price. A natural monopoly is this weird situation where it's actually most efficient for a monopoly to exist, for only one firm to supply the good. And so that's in an unusual circumstance like the distribution of poles and wires. So imagine I'm an electricity company and I connect all the houses in Australia to my electricity network. It doesn't make sense for you, Ebony, to set up your own electricity distribution network, build your own poles and wires and connect every set of electricity, every house in Australia to your network, because then you've got to basically build two distribution networks, which is twice as expensive as just one. So when natural monopolies exist, it's cheaper because of the huge upfront costs just to have one network, to have a monopoly. And so it makes sense for the government either to heavily regulate or traditionally just to own the network. And therefore, the government's not trying to make a profit from the network. They're just trying to provide the good to customers at a reasonable price.
So Richard, coming back to this idea of monopoly, not a natural monopoly, but monopolies and oligopolies, and where there isn't enough competition in the market, how does Australia go generally in terms of competition?
We're world world's best. I mean, when it comes to having oligopolies, we rock. No, seriously, like our banking industry is the most concentrated and most profitable in the world. Our retail sector, Coles and Woolworths, have got like 70% market share. In America, the big two retailers have got like 30% market share. Two airlines, a couple of electricity companies, one hardware store. Australia has this incredible concentration of market power. And what, economics, literally the economics 101 that we're teaching you now, what are the consequences of that? High prices and high profits. It's the exact opposite of competition. But we've flipped it on its head in Australia and said, look how profitable our banks are. They're world beating in the making profit stakes. They must be competitive. All right, so we get this rhetorical problem. A competitive banking system would be a banking system where they make virtually no profit. Because what profit's really exciting. From an economist's point of view, it's a genius experiment. Because in perfect competition, brackets almost never happens, in perfect competition, if I'm making a profit, Matt greedily looks at my profit and thinks, wow, Richard's making out like a bandit. I'm going to enter that industry. I'm going to increase the supply. We're going to push the price down. And we'll both go and make a lot less money and help the customers. So profit is this signal for people to enter the industry and bid those profits down. But that is just not how the Australian economy works. We have these incredible barriers to entry, either regulations stopping me setting up a bank, or patents and intellectual property, or somehow property developers have this genius skill that they can get land rezoned, and I don't have that skill. So I have no chance of getting into the most profitable industry in Australia, and that's rezoning dairy farms into suburbs.
Yeah, wow. So Matt, I feel like that kind of brings us back around to a concept that was raised a lot last week when we were talking about when markets work well, and that is billionaires. Mm-hmm. What are billionaires a sign of in a market?
They're a sign of market failure. They're a sign that effectively you cannot become a billionaire without exploiting a market, without exploiting your customers and getting them to pay more than you would if the market was highly competitive or perfectly competitive. So if you go and you have a look at the Business Review Weekly 200 Rich list, as Richard said, the most profitable thing to do in Australia is as a property developer. There's more billionaires in Australia that are property developers. There's certainly more on the Business Review Weekly Rich list that are property developers than any other kind of industry. Because basically, if you've got access to rezoning, if you've got access to politicians and can convince them to change land and develop it, then you can make enormous amounts of money. The other people on the Business Review Weekly Rich list are miners, which is a very concentrated industry. But it's also, if you own the rights to mine a particular resource, then nobody else can mine that resource. You have the monopoly rights over that, and so you're able to make big profits. So essentially, if the market was working well, then huge profits, the kind of profits you'd need to become a billionaire, huge profits would attract a whole heap of other people to come into the market because they'd say, wow, Ebony's making huge money in this market. I want to get in and get some of that. So they'd all enter the market, and all they'd actually do is massively increase the supply, decrease the price, and eat up all the profit. So the fact that billionaires exist is a sign that a market has failed somewhere.
And I just want to unpick that a little bit more and probably go back to the other end. So we were talking about billionaires being a sign of market failure. And at the other end of the scale, we've talked about the proliferation and persistence of cafes across Australia, small cafes, independent cafes, really not following that trend in Australia. Starbucks, for example, started up here and didn't go very well. What is it about cafes that work well in the Australian market when all of the hardware stores have basically been replaced by Bunnings? What's happening there, Matt?
Yeah, so over the last 20, 30, 40 years, there's been this concentration, what economists call concentration. That is that we keep reducing the number of firms in a market. And so they're turning it, as Richard said, into oligopolies. But there are a few industries that don't do that, and cafes is one of them. And it's interesting, as a non-coffee drinker, I don't drink coffee and I don't go into cafes. I think, so take this as with that in mind.
Does that make you a coffee snob, Matt?
No, I think that it's because we're coffee snobs that we value that kind of artisan sort of part of making of coffee, that we don't want to get it from a big chain. We don't want mass-produced coffee. We want really good quality coffee that we think can be done in small cafes. And before I came on, I was thinking, well, what are other countries snobs about? And I thought, well, if you went to Italy, pizza would be something that, that they value and prize. So I went and checked. Pizza Hut. Pizza Hut is available in over 100 countries around the world. It is in China, it is in Russia, it is in all kinds of countries. Pizza Hut isn't in Italy. It sells Italian food and it is not in Italy. Probably because the Italians think, well, why would I go to Pizza Hut to get high quality pizza when, there's a small restaurant in the local community that does a better job? And so, these kind of mass-produced places just don't get a foothold in those kind of cultures.
Richard, coming back to you, there's a couple of other topics we've just explored in the tutorial that I want to pick up on. One is imperfect information and another is equity. When I think of imperfect information, I think of superannuation and how for the first 30 years that I was on this earth, I think I had a superannuation account for about 10 of those and didn't look at it, didn't know how many accounts I had, never knew anything about how my super worked or where it was invested or anything like that. Am I on the right track then thinking about imperfect information and superannuation?
Yeah, so if a market is going to efficiently allocate scarce resources, if a market is going to match what people want with what other people have got, then all sides of the transaction have to be pretty well informed. So if let's take an example where it works pretty well. Picture a fish market. There's dozens, hundreds of people in a big cold shed selling seafood. You can do a lap pretty quickly, get a pretty good sense of who's got what. You can see the prices. It's not perfect information because you haven't tasted the dead fish before you've cooked it, but you can get a good sense of it. So it's pretty a well-informed market. And then, the other end of the extreme, you've got superannuation, where, the average Australian just, I'm not talking about you, Ebony, I'm talking about everyone else, knows nothing about the fund they're in, the fees they're being charged, the cumulative cost of those fees over years. And we use the term confusopoly. There are market structures out there designed to just confuse the hell out of people, which is a terrible way to sell a product, but it's a great way to keep people using a product they've already got. So it's really hard to switch internet providers. It's really hard to switch super. It's really hard to switch banks. This is not an accident. This is firms with market power colluding on process to make the act of shopping around tedious and slow and expensive, knowing that full well that means people will just sit tight and keep paying way too much money. And, I challenged people. Oh, hello, Kat. I challenged people.
She'll stop attacking my feet.
I challenged people a few weeks ago to go and switch. If you're with the big four banks, don't donate $5,000 a year to them. Donate to the Australia Institute instead. Really, $100 a week is what some people are donating to the big banks because they are either too busy, apparently, or too scared or too uncertain to switch. Well, you can save yourself far more than that by switching out of a high fee superannuation fund into a very low fee fund. And again, it'll take half an hour. It might take 2 hours. It's excruciating. But, I'd work for a couple of grand an hour. I don't know about you, but I reckon that's a pretty good bang for your buck. But the costs aren't just time, they're psychological. And we have to be clear about this. The people that design these systems make it stressful to switch. They make it scary to switch. They make it confusing to switch, because that way you'll keep giving them money. And that is the exact opposite of a competitive market. It's a profitable market. It's a very profitable market, but it's the exact opposite of a competitive market.
Matt, the next one, and the last topic to cover here before we go to questions from the audience is equity. What does that refer to?
Well, equity just means, equity can mean lots of different things to different people. But what do you mean in particular?
Oh, I just saw it come up as one of the topics people mentioned and things like that. So we can move to questions from the audience, and we might get a more specific question from there if that's more helpful. So I'm going to go to the first question now from Cecily Chio. I hope I've pronounced that correct, Cecily. I'm sorry. Why do people cite what is happening with the stock market to indicate that the market is working well or otherwise? Richard, do you want to take that one?
I have no idea.
Fantastic question.
It's a great question. So I know why the weather map is on the news at night. It's so that I can look at the weather and see what happened near where I live or other people live, and more importantly, see what's going to do tomorrow. I have no idea why we get, what happened to the ASX 200 or the Hang Seng or the FTSE or the NASDAQ. The handful of people who care about that hear about it live on their phone all day long. You don't need to know about it. I don't need to know about it. I think it performs a cultural function. I think it performs a symbolic function. And just to go back, it's really hard to get a couple of minutes on the news each night. Like, a prime minister making a big announcement might get a whole minute on the electronic news. We spend more than that talking about what happened to some share prices. Unfortunately, I think and by the way, not all countries do this. We're a little bit obsessed in Australia, a bit insecure, I'd suggest. What it really does is bookend the news and remind us that complicated stuff that you don't understand is happening out there, so you should keep your head down. It doesn't perform an information function. It doesn't perform a democratic function. As I said, anyone that wants to know can get it on their phone. It's really just a sort of cultural artifact to remind us what the news people tell us is important. And to be clear, the ABC do it too. They have a show called The Business. Why don't they have a show called The Society or The NGO Movement or The Environment? Like we're kind of told that this stuff's important because we're putting it up on a pedestal all the time, but it's not.
Yeah, and look, and when the stock market is doing well, what that means is that companies are profitable. Now, as we just discussed, companies are most profitable when markets are failing and there's not much competition. So a booming stock market could just mean that, people think that profits are going to go up because, businesses are going to do well. It doesn't mean that we as a society are doing well. It doesn't mean that consumers are doing well. It doesn't mean that workers are doing well. It just means that businesses, big businesses in particular, are being very profitable at the moment.
And just on that, sorry, there's a really important trick that now gets played. Because everyone that works is kind of forced to have superannuation, and I don't hate superannuation, but it's rare to force people to do something when you think you're into free markets. So we force everyone to buy superannuation. That means everyone owns some shares in some stuff. So when your bank rips you off, their profit goes up. When your petrol company rips you off and you pay too much for petrol, their profit goes up. But in Australia now we're told, don't complain about that. That's good, because you own some shares in that. So ripping yourself off is actually good for you. Like, this is just batshit crazy. But it's quite common in Australia to hear that the surging bank profits are good for mum and dad investors. No, they're good for people that own 100,000 or $1 million worth of shares in the Commonwealth Bank. You bet. But, to say to low income earners who've got 30,000 bucks in super, of which a couple of grand is in Commonwealth Bank shares, to say ripping them off with fees and charges and high interest rates is helping them, we're through the looking glass.
You've just kind of blown my mind that the news all around the world doesn't have Alan Kohler at the end with the share price and the price of the dollar. The next question is from Kevin Hayes, who says, free trade agreements, are they really free, or do they have terms and conditions for such agreements? And is there as much political acclaim surrounding free trade agreements Should we be doubting the veracity of such claims?
Look, I can write. I can write a free trade agreement in a sentence. Literally, there will be no restrictions on trade between Australia and insert country here. Done. We now have a free trade agreement. The Australia-US free trade agreement's 1,400 pages long. You know what the 1,400 pages spell out? All the agreed restrictions on trade. Literally, okay. It's literally. I can write a there will be no restrictions on trade deal. There's no problem at all. So we've basically got what the Productivity Commission, pinky leftos that they are, they call them preferential trade agreements, where one country doesn't promise to trade freely. One country says, I'm going to treat this other country special in exchange for them treating me a bit special. And the problem with the language of free trade agreements is, and the Australia Institute, led the charge on this 15 years ago when we're doing the Australia-US free trade agreement. We have a good system for pricing pharmaceuticals in Australia. The Americans wanted to rip up our system and make Australians pay a lot more for pharmaceuticals. The Australia Institute was very opposed to those provisions in the free trade agreement, which meant we got accused of being opposed to free trade. Like it's meaningless. Like we couldn't have a democratic conversation about what's in the agreement because you had to agree to what the title was, not the contents. And just one last quick point, Australia has a free trade agreement with China. We got all excited when it happened. Revolutionary, it's going to change everything. Woohoo, look, we got a free trade agreement with China. Well, look how China's treating us at the moment. Our free trade agreement with China is worthless. Absolutely worthless. It wasn't a free trade agreement in the first place. And when they don't feel like paying attention to it, they don't. And, and Australia's the same. We ignore provisions in the trade agreements we've signed whenever we feel like it.
All right. I've got a question here from Duncan Ritchie. What is the best introduction book to take these discussions forward? For example, he's looking for some type of economics for dummies question. I'm just going to put a quick plug in, Duncan, for our colleague Jim Stanford. He's written a book called Economics for Everyone. He's the director at the Centre for Future Work. Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism by Jim Stanford. Matt, Richard, what books would you recommend? Richard, you've written a few.
Well, thanks for not plugging mine. No, Jim's book is a ripper, and it is a kind of introductory kind of textbook for non-students. My book, Econobabble, How to Decode Spin and Economic Nonsense, isn't written as a textbook, but it's written to kind of explain some key concepts and help kind of strip the power of language away. Look, I guess, in Australia, we talk about the economy all the time. We don't talk about economics very much. I'd read Ross Gitton's columns in the Sydney Morning Herald. I think he does a very, very good job of kind of just telling people what's going on in very plain and simple language. And I'd read any of J.K. Galbraith's books. They're old now. But yeah, one of my favorite economists, and writes beautifully and clearly, and the problems of market failure and oligopoly and monopoly we've talked about today. He really was breaking that down 30 or 40 years ago, and the books haven't dated at all. Matt,
anything you'd add to that?
I think Richard's book Affluenza is another good one.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, just plug you in there. You can pay me later.
I'm off the Christmas card list.
But no, look, I mean, I just second Jim's book. Like, it's written like a textbook, but it's written in a way that everybody could understand. So it's written really clearly. But if you wanted to go through all of the concepts of economics, then that's a great resource.
Excellent. Thank you. Great question, I thought, because, there's often things that I watch in these and then think, I'd like to read up a bit more on that. So we'll try and make a note of those and maybe send around some links to where you can get them from when we send around the link to this video. The next question is from Laura Barnes, and there's a few people like Christy Breakspear as well, who've asked questions on a similar theme here. Does Australia's relatively low population number and density make it more difficult to do competition well? And Christy asks, is there any connection between oligopolies and a country with a low to medium population density?
Well, probably not. Why do I say this? Because we seem to do competition better 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And yet, you know, if you go back 40 years ago, there wasn't any internet. There wasn't any, like the internet has introduced where you can get products from anywhere. So I don't think that population and density has a great deal to do with it. You can have a highly competitive economy in a highly dense large population, or a sparse decentralized, and particularly in the modern world with the internet. I think what's more important is the kind of regulatory framework, and this is where it gets all boring, but it's the kind of rules that we have around competition. And I think that the rules in Australia, some of them are really good, but they're getting a bit dated, and they probably need a big update and a big expansion. Yeah. Go, Richard.
Thanks, Matt. And hi, Christy, long time no see, former author of Australia Institute research many, many years ago. Great question. Look, it's a really interesting question, and I think there's something in your question. I think with a very small population, it's possible that you can't have enough room in the market for competition, but I don't think that's what's happening in Australia. So, for example, we've got some of the fastest population growth in the developed world in Australia. Our population,
before COVID.
Well, before COVID, but even still, like, it's pretty high. You watch, you'll come back fast. But our population's grown rapidly over the last 20 years, but our competition's declined. So I think a very small population or a very diffuse population could have that effect. And within Australia, it does happen in some places. So remote Indigenous communities get robbed blind when they pay, like, you know, the unemployment benefits aren't higher out in those places. The age pension isn't higher out in those places, but the price of petrol is, and the price of lettuce is, because, you know, in a small town with one petrol station or one corner store, guess what? You're going to get ripped off. So within the country, yes, but across Australia, no. We're big enough. It's the law. And just quickly on that, the ACCC, our competition watchdog, I think it has a red hot go, but it loses so many cases in court because our laws are crap and our laws are out of date. So having a good, vigorous regulator, which we do, is really important, but we've got to give them better rules to work with.
And it's important to remember who wins from a lack of competition. Rich, powerful people win from a lack of competition. So who's lobbying for, when we try and introduce new competition laws, when we try and beef up the ACCC, who's the one lobbying against it? Well, it's the rich and the powerful that lobby against that. It's the rich and the powerful that got the most to lose from more competition. As someone famously said, you know, the only people who benefit from competition are consumers. Certainly not business that benefit.
And sorry, but just back to where we started with, you know, the billionaires are proof of market failure. In a highly competitive or perfectly competitive market, there's no profit. You know, if I start making a profit, I just attract new entrants, and we just keep bidding the profit down, and it's a bloodbath between each of the companies involved. But in Australia, we look to the business community to tell us what's good for the economy. Like, again, talk about flipped on its head. All right, the purpose of setting up a business is to make a lot of profit for me. That's fine, all right? But the point of economics and the point of competition policy is to deliver benefits for consumers. But in Australia, who are the go-to people on how do we reform the economy? What's good for the economy? Oh, well, good morning, CEO of big company that makes a lot of money, therefore clearly isn't in competition. So we literally go to the beneficiaries of oligopoly market power and we ask them about wages. We ask them about competition policy. We ask them about regulation. Again, if we cared about the economy, and there's no evidence that we do, if we cared about the economy, we might ask economists. But no, I'm a lefty. Let's go ask a capitalist who makes a monopoly profit what's good for the economy.
The next question is from Chris Chaplin. From the tutorial, how does or should an economy decide between regulation and market forces? When should ethical considerations be up to the consumer? For example, choosing to pay more for free trade certified coffee or shoes, cheap shoes made by children working in terrible overseas sweatshops. Matt, do you want to take that one first?
That is a great question. And I'm going to start by saying I'm an economist, and you shouldn't ask economists that. These are all ethical questions. These are all questions that we as a society should decide. As an economist, I can tell you what might be a more efficient way of doing it, what your options are, what the costs are of various options. But ultimately, the decision is a democratic one. It's a society one. So, where should we have sweatshops? Should we buy from sweatshops? How should we produce? What should we create? These are in the ethical sense. These are all democratic questions. These are all societal questions. These aren't questions that we should be rushing to economists to ask. We should be asking economists, well, what are the options and what are the costs of our various options? But they're not the ones who should make those decisions.
Yeah, let me give you a good example. Like, we had a big debate in Australia, it's still ongoing, but we've come a long way on something like free range eggs. Because when I buy an egg at the shop, I can't tell how the chicken who laid it felt. Right? I can weigh the egg, but I have no idea how the chicken was treated. And after many, many years of advocacy, strangely enough, with the people that profit from selling eggs, telling everybody what they needed to know, after years, decades of trying, we now have much clearer labeling. So we can have sort of, free range eggs and cage eggs and battery eggs. And that means there's much better information in the market and people can express better choices. So sometimes we just kind of need information, but the information just doesn't pop up. Just getting the information requires enormous regulatory effort. But yeah, so we know when we've got free range chickens, and I don't mean to be crass, but we don't know when we've got free range factories. There are people that get chained to machines in other countries who make stuff that's for sale in Australian shops. And I know more about the egg than I do about the shoe. So it's very hard for me as a consumer to kind of think, well, it's only $1 more. I think I'd rather pay a bit more for a shoe that was made by someone that wasn't treated inhumanely. So markets can do a lot when they're well informed, but you often need regulation to get the information in the market, but information is not nearly enough, especially when there's a long supply chain and there's lots of layers of people doing things, because the people you buy from might be nice, but people might be treated terribly along the way.
The next question is from Natalie Hanna, and I think, again, this one might be for you, Richard. Mining. It may be profitable, but it is highly risky. Only about 1 in 100 exploration tenements turn into an economic resource or a mine, and exploration costs a lot. So is it really a monopoly, Richard?
Well, it is often a monopoly because by definition. So if I have a mining lease, if I buy the lease to explore and mine on a particular bit of land, you're not allowed to come and mine on it. So by definition, I have a local monopoly. I might not be the only person in Australia mining gold, but I'm the only person that's allowed to mine gold in a particular place. So that's definitely a form of monopoly. That's a definitional issue. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm sort of being exploitative. I might be able to make huge profits out of that. And as the questioner says, that might encourage me to do the expensive, risky work of drilling and testing, et cetera, et cetera. But, we can actually have our cake and eat it too. Economists in other countries where the mining industry isn't so powerful, they basically have a progressive profit tax system. If I earn a lot more than someone, I'll probably pay more income tax. It's possible to design taxes on the mining industry the same way, so that means that they can make bigger profits to help recover that risky exploration. But if they are making enormous amounts of money digging up our gold, digging up our coal, digging up our oil, then the nation state collects the resources. And my favourite example of this is compare Saudi Arabia and Newcastle. Newcastle's the world's biggest coal port. The people that sit in Newcastle don't make a cent out of it. Saudi Arabia has nationalized nearly all of the profits from their oil and made themselves some of the richest people in the world.
Along with quite a few other things. The next question here I've got is from, where did it go? I had a good one here. Now I've lost it. From John Baker. What are some of the methods of measuring the performance of natural and unnatural monopolies, especially in the public service, to assess their efficiency, effectiveness, and governance, that type of thing? Matt, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, look, the public service is interesting. It provides an essential role, and at the same time, when it comes to sort of things like productivity, it's really hard to measure. So a great example is a librarian. If a librarian does a really good job for a researcher, they'll be able to show them where to go to get the information they need. But how can you possibly measure that productivity gain? Whereas if you work in a factory and you're producing tables, you know, and you introduce a change to how the factory produces, then, and you get more tables at the end for the same amount of stuff, then you've had a productivity gain. That's easy to measure. So how the public service works and how it makes society better, well, absolutely it does that, but it's quite difficult to measure. And sometimes when we can't measure something, particularly in economics, when we can't measure it, we devalue it. We don't think it's as important because we can't add it into our model. We can't measure it. So the public sector kind of suffers, I think, a bit from that problem, in that because we can't measure how well it does and what it does, then we tend to devalue it and think, well, it's not important. And you know, bashing public servants is a great pastime, and governments on both sides love to do it.
I agree with everything Matt said, but of course in the private sector, it's really, really, really hard to measure the productivity of the CEO of a big bank. It's really hard to measure the productivity of all sorts of middle and upper managers in the private sector. And these are the best paid people in the country. So, you know, we kind of use the idea that it's hard to measure the productivity of a psych nurse, or it's really hard to measure the productivity of a childcare worker, because it's so hard to measure the output. It's so hard to measure the compassion, the quality, the attention, so hard to measure the important parts of it. Well, it's really hard to measure what the CEO of a bank does too, but it doesn't stop us giving them enormous amounts of money.
Sure doesn't. The next question is from Louise Karamaris. How does the market and economic theory factor in or take into account the quality of the air I breathe, the cleanliness of the water I drink, and the quality of the fruit and vegetables and herbs and things that I eat? Richard, do you want to take this one? Or Matt? There you go.
Like, is the short answer. Quality is this fantastic thing that is the most profitable misunderstood thing. So when it comes to quality, we don't know how to measure quality in a lot of things. And so therefore, what we do is we need a shortcut for it. And sometimes that shortcut is price. So we might think, well, there are two products, one is more expensive than the other, so the more expensive one must be of a higher quality. And if I'm looking for something and I want it, and I think, well, actually this is an important thing and I don't want it to break down, or I want it to work all the time, I might actually choose to buy the more expensive thing based solely on the fact that it is more expensive and that I therefore think it's of a higher quality. But if you're making stuff and selling it, right, and you know that people use this shortcut of a higher price means a higher quality, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to put your price up, aren't you? Like, it's the obvious answer in order to sell more. And in fact, sometimes when you know, a new entrepreneur gets into the market with a new product and they're struggling to sell it, they'll hire a marketing manager, and one of the things the marketing manager will do is say, put up the price. And just putting the price up means they sell more, because suddenly people think, oh, that's not a crap cheap product, that's an expensive high quality product, and that's what they need to do. So quality is this great thing that, as I said, is a thing that can be incredibly profitable for firms, because people so misunderstand, or not misunderstand, that they struggle to be able to measure it and to know ahead of time. How do I know that this thing in plastic, these two things in plastic, which one's of a higher quality? Well, I don't until I've used it and one of them's broken.
Richard, I think that question also goes to that idea of externalities and particularly negative externalities. And it was, I think, the Stern report that famously said that climate change is the most massive market failure. Pollution is a negative externality, polluting the air that we breathe. We've just had a couple of state governments put a tax on electric vehicles, but not heavy trucks that do the most damage, as you've said. Talk to us a little bit more about that idea, particularly of negative externalities and how the market accounts or doesn't for them.
Yeah. So look, if I'm going to make a phone, then I need to buy the metal. I need to buy the glass. I need to buy the silicon chips. I'm not going to need to pay labor to put it all together. When I make something, I have to pay for the ingredients. And then I have to get a price that's great enough to cover the costs of all the ingredients. Now, when I make some things, I have a lot of waste at the end of it. And I have to pay to have the waste taken away. I have to pay to have waste taken away from my house. If you knock down a house to build a new one, you have to pay to have the rubble taken away. So waste disposal is part of the production process. But what we've got with energy in Australia, around the world, what we've got with climate change is a whole industry that doesn't pay for waste disposal. It pumps carbon dioxide, it pumps carbon monoxide, it pumps particulate pollution into the atmosphere and doesn't have to pay for it. And because it doesn't have to pay for its waste disposal, it's cheaper than it would otherwise be. So my phone would be cheaper if Apple didn't have to pay for glass. But you don't run around, you don't hear people saying, well, we need to keep phones cheap, so let's give Apple free glass. But the same people say, well, we have to keep energy cheap, so let's give the coal-fired power stations free waste disposal. So when we give free waste disposal, it's not costless to us as a community. It just means the factory or the power station doesn't have to pay for it. I have to pay for it through asthma. I have to pay for it through irritated eyes. I have to pay for it through climate change. But I'm external to the transaction. So I incur the costs of someone else's production decision, but I don't have any market power. I can't stop buying it. If you want to buy it and they want to sell it, I can't stop it. So I'm external to the transaction, but I experience the adverse consequences. So yeah, externalities are a very common, very well-known form of market failure. And really the determination of people in Australia to support the coal industry has meant we've really, again, just turned economics on its head in Australia. We now pretend that giving free waste disposal to an industry is good for the economy, when 20 years ago we were forcing everyone to pay for their waste disposal. We used to take garbage to the dump and dump it at the dump. When I was a kid, the good old days, you went to the dump. Now we have waste disposal facilities, and everyone takes for granted that if you generated the waste, you should pay for it. Well, once upon a time, economics drove that kind of debate in Australia. Today, we say that pollution is good for jobs. It's ridiculous.
Matt, I want to come back to the question of quality that you were talking about and productivity as well. We often joke in the office at morning teas and things like that, if someone brings fancy bread from like Sonoma or a local 3 Mills, that we're eating low productivity artisanal bread and we're reducing the productivity. Why do we joke about that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
And what does that have to do with market failures?
Yeah, so there was a famous productivity report that came out that was lamenting the fact that the productivity in baked goods was going down because people were buying more artisanal bread. Now, if you imagine, if you make an artisanal loaf, right, it's not mass produced. It requires more labor, it requires more energy to produce that one loaf of bread. So from an economics point of view, right, from a productivity point of view, more resources to produce the same amount of stuff means that productivity's gone down. All right. But the problem with all of that is the idea that a mass-produced loaf is exactly the same as an artisanal loaf, that consumers don't think they're different. Now, given that consumers have a preference or are moving towards more artisanal stuff, they're paying more for it, then obviously they think that there is a quality difference between those two. So, if you ask an economist, from the Productivity Commission, they can't measure the quality, so they just assume they're all the same. So they think the productivity is going down. The Productivity Commission, they don't want to see that, so they think that's bad. But in reality, all it is an example again of them not being able to measure something, so dismissing what I can't measure and focusing on what I can measure and getting entirely the wrong result.
And someone's joked that we joked about that because we're all economists at the Australia Institute. Well, we're not all economists, but even us non-economists now know to joke about artisanal bread failing the economy. Possibly us and the Productivity Commission is the only lunchrooms on earth where you'll find jokes about that. I will just finish up. We've only got a couple of minutes to go. Louise Keramaris has asked, in your assessment, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is catastrophic, how bad is market failure in Australia today? I'll start with you, Matt.
Oh, wow. You're asking me to measure something that's multidimensional and that I can't measure. Look, I think that Australian economy is getting worse and worse. It's becoming more what economists call concentrated. That is, there are less and less firms in every industry. I think that, firms are able to buy up and outcompete other firms, and they're just basically merging up. And we seem to have a system that advantages big firms over little firms. And I think that's going to be bad in the long term. So, I don't know what it is from 1 to 10, but I know that it's getting worse. Every decade, it's getting worse and worse. And again, it comes down to the rules of the game. And as a society, we're the ones that should be setting the rules to the game through a democratic process. And ultimately, I think we need to change those rules in order to make more competition in the country, not less. And
Richard,
when
what
we're
about you?
making those decisions, we shouldn't be talking to the people who are winning from the current system.
Look, Matt, you're gutless. I'll have a stab. Look,
Yeah,
it's
give
got
me
to
a
be
number, Richard.
Yeah, it's got to be 9 out of 10.
And not 9.5 or 8.5, just 9.
I'm a 9.3 kind of guy.
Inaccurate to 4 decimal places.
Yeah, economists always like to confuse people with precision. It conceals our inaccuracy. So, look, climate change is the biggest externality. It is the biggest market failure of all, and we are categorically, determinedly, willfully ignoring it and heading headlong into a climate catastrophe caused by market failure. So in the scheme of that, the fact that the banks make enormous profits at our expense is a pretty low order issue. So, what scares me, what concerns me, what infuriates me is that economists aren't stupid and economics isn't stupid. But that doesn't mean a lot of stupid stuff isn't said about the economy, often by economists. We understand market failure. We know how to fix climate change, and we're not doing it. And we know that it won't ruin the economy to switch one form of energy for another. We know that. It'll cost people who make fossil fuel energy a lot of money. It'll make another group who don't have as much political power a lot of money. So we know this and we're ignoring it nonetheless. So, yeah, I'm going to go with 9.324, Matt.
Ooh, that's very accurate. That's very precise. So therefore, it must be very accurate.
Yeah.
Richard, I'm just going to come back to you for one final observation, and not connected to really anything in today's discussion, but more to what's happening in politics at the moment. We've got a big argument happening around superannuation and not increasing the superannuation guarantee to 10% next year, because that's just taking from workers' wages. In under a minute, can you tell us what's happening in that debate?
So again, in perfect competition, millions of buyers, millions of sellers, wages would be set, by the market, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's not happening. We've got big companies in Australia with enormous market power who just kind of refuse to boost the wages of their employees. So telling them to pay more through boosting minimum wages, boosting award wages, and boosting superannuation is one of the key ways we get some money into people's pockets. So the people running around saying, if I spend an extra $1 on super, I'm going to take $1 in wage growth off you, they're people assuming we have a perfectly competitive labour market. We've just spent an hour talking about how we have the most concentrated oligopolistic market in the world, in the developed world, I would suggest. So wage setting has got far more to do with institutions and power than market forces. So that said, I think the big issue really is tax concessions for super, which just pour money into the pockets of well-paid middle-aged blokes like me and do literally nothing to help low-income earners, particularly women, who work part-time or casual throughout their lives. The tax concessions help me, who needs it least, and do nothing to help the people who need it most.
But to summarise, if the superannuation guarantee doesn't go ahead next year, we shouldn't all be banking on a pay rise.
No, and we've had no increase in super for years, and the lowest wage growth on record. So the idea that there's this one-for-one trade-off has got nothing to do with evidence.
All right, well, it's 3 o'clock, so we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. We really appreciate your support for Economics Academy. It's our first crack at it, and we've kind of been blown away by the response. We are intending to pick it up again next year, so we might send an email out to get a bit of feedback from you about what you liked and what we could improve on for next year. But thank you, Richard Denniss and Matt Grudnoff, for all your time and for your excellent tutorials as well. Thank you, everyone, for all your fabulous questions. As always, we're sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And don't forget, all the content will be up on our homepage for Economics Academy. You can rewatch it to your heart's content. Really make sure you can win all those fights at Christmas dinner. And don't forget to come to the last 3 of our webinars for the year. Next Tuesday, the 1st of December at 6 p.m, not 11 a.m, 6 p.m. We'll be talking to human rights lawyer Jennifer Robinson and investigative reporter Peter Cronau about the new book on WikiLeaks, A Secret Australia, it's called. Come along to that. Next Thursday, December the 3rd at 11 a.m, we'll be talking to Nobel laureate economist Professor Joseph Stiglitz about regulating the big tech giants. And on Wednesday, the 9th of December at 10 a.m, we'll be talking to Laura Tingle about what Australia can learn from New Zealand. That's the topic of her next quarterly essay coming up. Thanks so much for your time. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money. Keep an eye out for emails from us over the summer. Stay 1.5 meters away, wear a mask, keep washing those hands, and stay safe out there, everyone. Thanks, and hopefully we'll see you next week, if not next year. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Eb.